In 1851, a man named Herman Haupt stood at the base of the Hoosac Mountain in western Massachusetts and told a room full of investors he was going to cut a tunnel straight through it. 4¾ miles of solid rock, 25,000 feet. The mountain had been there since before recorded history, a wall of gneiss and schist and quartz that rose from the Deerfield River Valley like a locked gate between Boston and the markets of New York. And Haupt, a 34-year-old civil engineer from Philadelphia, who had already built bridges for the Pennsylvania Railroad and studied at West Point, looked at that wall and said he could open it. The tunnel would take 24 years to build. It would kill 195 men. It would nearly bankrupt the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which spent more on this single hole in the ground than it spent running the entire state government in any given year. And when the two halves of the tunnel finally met, deep beneath the summit of the mountain, on November 27, 1873, the alignment was off by less than 1/4 of an inch. This is the story of the Hoosac Tunnel. Not just the engineering, and not just the dying, but the specific men who held the drills and lit the fuses and climbed into a vertical shaft 1,000 feet deep because someone told them there was work at the bottom. Their names are mostly gone now. The mountain kept them. To understand why anyone would attempt something this reckless, you have to understand what Massachusetts looked like in the 1840s. The Erie Canal had opened in 1825, and overnight it rerouted the commerce of the entire northeastern United States through New York. Goods that once moved through Boston now flowed down the Hudson. Massachusetts mill owners, men who ran the textile factories and paper mills that were the economic engine of New England, watched their competitive advantage drain away like water through a cracked dam. They needed a railroad route west, a direct line from Boston through the mountains to Troy, New York, where they could connect with the Western Rail Network. But the Hoosac Range stood in the way. Not a single peak you could wind around, but a continuous ridge, an extension of Vermont's Green Mountains, running across the northwestern corner of the state like a barricade. There were two choices. You could lay track over the mountain, which meant grades so steep that locomotives of the era could barely climb them, burning fuel at ruinous cost on every trip. Or you could go through. Alva Crocker, a self-made paper mill magnate from Fitchburg, chose through. In 1848, he secured a charter for the Troy and Greenfield Railroad, with provisions for a tunnel through Hoosac Mountain. The estimated cost was $2 million. The estimated construction time was 5 years. Both numbers were, in hindsight, almost comically wrong. But Crocker was not a man who dealt in hindsight. He dealt in ambition. If this is the kind of history that holds your attention, the kind where real men built real things and paid real prices for it, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell these stories because nobody else will. Construction began on January 8, 1851, at the West Portal in North Adams, and the trouble started almost immediately. The first approach was a machine called the excavator, a nearly 100-ton cast-iron boring device with a 25-foot cutting wheel designed to chew through the rock face and carve the entire tunnel circumference in a single pass. It was an elegant idea. It bored 10 feet into the mountain and froze solid. The rock was harder than anyone had predicted. The excavator was scrapped, and the first chief engineer, a man named A.F. Edwards, left the project shortly after. What replaced the machine was the oldest technology in mining: men. Two-man teams working a method called double jacking. One man held a steel drill against the rock face. The other swung a sledgehammer, driving the drill into the stone a fraction of an inch with each blow. After every strike, the man holding the drill rotated it slightly so the bit would not bind. Then the hammer came down again. hour after hour. Swing, rotate, swing. The sound inside the tunnel was a constant ringing of steel on steel, echoing off the wet rock walls in a space barely wide enough for two men to stand shoulder to shoulder. If you have never seen double-jacking done, you cannot fully appreciate what it demands. The man holding the drill trusts the man swinging the hammer with his hands, his fingers, his life. A missed strike does not bruise, it shatters bone. The drill holder sits or crouches inches from the rock face, his ears ringing, his hands numb from vibration, stone chips peppering his face and eyes with every blow. There were no safety goggles. There were no ear protections. There was a candle or a whale oil lamp stuck to the wall with clay, and the air smelled of sulfur and sweat and wet stone, and you could taste the rock dust on your tongue. They did this for 10 hours a day. When a hole was deep enough, perhaps 18 inches, perhaps 2 feet, they packed it with black powder and lit a fuse and ran. The explosion in that enclosed space was concussive, a punch of pressure and sound that left men's ears ringing for hours. Then they went back in, cleared the rubble by hand into wheelbarrows, and started drilling the next hole. The rate of advance by hand was measured in inches per day. Some weeks, a crew might move the tunnel face forward 8 or 10 feet. On bad weeks, when they hit a seam of quartz so dense it dulled every drill they owned, they might manage 3. At that pace, boring 4 3/4 miles of tunnel would take longer than anyone involved would live. The mathematics of it were merciless. 25,000 feet of rock at 10 feet per week is nearly 50 years. Half a century of men swinging hammers in the dark. Hermann Haupt arrived in 1856, brought in by a group of investors led by Edward Serrell. Haupt had engineered the Horseshoe Curve and the Gallitzin tunnels through the Allegheny Mountains for the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was one of the finest railroad engineers in the country. He also brought something the project desperately needed, which was his own money. He invested $20,000 personally and soon discovered that his fellow investors could not raise their share. Haupt became the largest single investor in a project that was already bleeding cash. Haupt was an innovator. He designed his own boring machines, filing patents in 1864 and 1865 for pneumatic drilling mechanisms. His designs used a piston that struck the steel like a hammer and a spiral ratchet to rotate the bit. But the machines broke down constantly in the brutal conditions inside the tunnel. The rock was unforgiving. The dust was blinding. The air was thick with the smell of black powder smoke and the metallic tang of fractured stone. And every piece of machinery that went into that hole came out battered. Haupt pushed forward anyway. By the time he left the project in 1861, he had excavated about 4,250 feet, roughly 1/5 of the total distance. On the east end, they had managed 500 feet. On the west, 1,810. But Haupt did not leave by choice. The Western Railroad, a competing line that ran a southern route through Springfield and Pittsfield, had been fighting the Hoosac Tunnel from the beginning. They lobbied the Massachusetts legislature relentlessly to block state funding, and in 1861, they succeeded. The money stopped. The Troy and Greenfield Railroad went bankrupt. Haupt was financially ruined. And then the Civil War called him to Washington, where he would become one of the most important military railroad engineers the Union Army ever had, rebuilding bridges and rail lines under fire for the battles of Bull Run and Gettysburg. He never came back to the Hoosac. He spent the rest of his life trying to recover his investment and received, after decades of litigation, 8 cents on every dollar he had put in. The tunnel sat mostly idle for 2 years. Water seeped through the rock and pooled in the unfinished bore. Timbers rotted. The few men left on site did maintenance work and little else. The mountain was winning. In 1863, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts foreclosed on the Troy and Greenfield Railroad and took direct control of the tunnel project. Alva Crocker, now the state superintendent of railroads, appointed Thomas Doane as the new chief engineer. Doane was methodical, where Haupt had been visionary. He did not invent new machines. He studied the ones that existed and figured out how to make them survive inside the mountain. But the real problem was not machinery. It was geometry. The tunnel had to be straight, dead straight. 4 3/4 miles of perfect alignment through solid rock, bored from two ends that could not see each other, with the mountain itself blocking any line of sight between them. If the two halves missed each other by even a few feet, the entire project could fail. And Doane knew that working from only two faces, east and west, would take decades more. So Doane proposed something that had never been attempted at this scale in America. He would sink a vertical shaft from the summit of the mountain straight down into the projected path of the tunnel, 1,028 feet below the surface. Once the shaft reached tunnel level, crews could begin digging outward in two directions from the center, creating 4 working faces instead of 2. The tunnel could then be excavated simultaneously from the east portal, the west portal, and both directions from the central shaft. The math was simple. 4 faces meant roughly twice the speed. The problem was the shaft itself. 1,000 feet straight down through living rock. Think about what that means. Imagine standing at the edge of a hole in the earth that drops straight down for 1,000 feet. That is taller than any building in America at the time. Taller than any building in the world at the time. You cannot see the bottom. You cannot hear the bottom. If you dropped a stone, you would count to 6 or 7 before you heard it hit. You lower men and equipment on a wooden hoist down a hole barely wide enough for the platform. And at the bottom, they work in near total darkness, breathing air that has traveled 1,000 feet through a stone chimney to reach them. The temperature at the bottom of the shaft was constant, around 50 degrees, summer and winter, and the humidity was close to 100%. Water dripped from every surface. The walls were slick with condensation. Every bucket of broken rock must be hauled back up that same shaft. Every barrel of water must be pumped out. Every tool, every timber, every ounce of black powder must go down the hole before it can be used. And the men who worked at the bottom rode an open wooden platform, suspended on ropes, with nothing between them and 1,000 feet of empty air except the strength of the hemp and the reliability of the winding mechanism above. Work on the central shaft began in 1863. It was slow, dangerous, miserable labor. By October of 1867, the shaft had reached a depth of roughly 580 feet. A hoist building sat on the surface directly above the shaft, housing the winding mechanism, the ropes, the tools. It also housed flammable materials, including oil for lamps, black powder for blasting, and a device called a gasometer that used gasoline fumes for illumination. On October 17, 1867, just after noon, 13 men descended into the shaft on the wooden platform. They were lowered to the bottom to continue digging. On the surface, 4 men worked in the hoist building. At some point that afternoon, a candle, or a spark, ignited naphtha fumes that had leaked from the gasometer. The explosion was immediate. Fire engulfed the hoist building, and the 4 men on the surface barely escaped with their lives. They tried to fight the fire. They failed. The burning building collapsed directly into the open shaft, sending flaming timbers, machinery, and debris raining down 580 feet onto the 13 men below. Some of them were killed instantly, impaled by falling drill steel or crushed by burning timbers. Others were not killed by the falling debris. They were killed slowly, by the carbon monoxide and smoke that poured down the shaft like poison poured into a well. There was no second exit. There was no ventilation. There was no rescue. It took a full year before crews could even recover the bodies. 13 men dead. It was the single deadliest day in the history of the Hoosac Tunnel, and it nearly ended the project entirely. Newspapers across Massachusetts called for the tunnel to be abandoned. Critics, including a young lawyer named Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who would later sit on the Supreme Court, had long mocked the project as the Great Bore. Now they had 13 more reasons to bury it. But the state did not stop, and the reason was economic desperation. Massachusetts needed that western rail connection. The money already spent was a sunk cost so enormous that abandoning the tunnel would have been its own kind of catastrophe. So they pressed on, and in doing so, they reached for technologies that had never been used at this scale in America. The first was nitroglycerin. Black powder had been the standard explosive since the tunnel began, but black powder was slow and weak. It cracked rock, it did not shatter it. A chemist named George Mowbray, working out of a small laboratory in North Adams, had been following European experiments with nitroglycerin, an explosive 10 times more potent than black powder. In 1866, Mowbray developed his own method for producing a modified form he called trinitroglycerin, and Thomas Doane authorized its use inside the tunnel with an electric firing system that allowed detonation from a safe distance using blasting caps and battery-powered circuits. The difference was immediate and staggering. Where black powder cracked and loosened rock, nitroglycerin shattered it. A single blast could advance the face by several feet instead of inches. The sound was different too. Black powder made a dull, thumping boom. Nitroglycerin made a crack so sharp and violent that men working hundreds of feet behind the blast face could feel it in their teeth. Over the remaining years of construction, more than 500,000 pounds of nitroglycerin would be used inside the Hoosac Tunnel. It was the first large-scale commercial use of nitroglycerin in the United States, and it was terrifying. The liquid was unstable. It could detonate from impact, from heat, from friction, from reasons that nobody fully understood. A jar dropped from waist height could kill every man in the room. Mowbray stored it in a specially built magazine outside the tunnel portals, and the men who carried it to the working face did so in small quantities, walking slowly, their hands steady, their breathing shallow. Workers learned to handle it the way you learn to handle a live snake, with absolute concentration and the knowledge that a single careless moment could be your last. On cold days, the nitroglycerin could freeze, and frozen nitroglycerin was even more dangerous than the liquid form. The men who thought it did so with warm water and patience, and they did it knowing that the substance in their hands could erase them from the world without warning. The second innovation came from a man named Charles Burley. Burley was a steam engine builder from Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and in 1866, working with Stephen Gates and John Brooks, he patented a drill powered by compressed air. The Burley drill was the first commercially successful pneumatic rock drill in history, and it changed everything. Instead of two men swinging a hammer and rotating a bit by hand, a single machine could drive a piston against the drill steel 200 to 300 times per minute, advancing a hole at roughly a foot every 2 minutes. The drill weighed 372 pounds and was mounted on a carriage that could support a dozen units at the tunnel face simultaneously. It pounded itself to pieces regularly. A quarter of the drills were down for repairs at any given time. But even at reduced capacity, it was 6 times faster than hand drilling. Compressed air solved a second problem as well. The airlines that powered the Burley drills also ventilated the tunnel, pushing breathable air to the working faces, where men had been laboring in foul, smoke-choked darkness. For the first time, the tunnel could be worked without men choking on the residue of their own blasting. The combination of the Burley drill, nitroglycerin, and the central shaft transformed the pace of construction. Under Doane, the central shaft reached its full depth of 1,028 feet in 1870, and crews began boring outward from the bottom in both directions. The tunnel was now being advanced from 4 faces simultaneously. Progress jumped from single-digit feet per week to over 100 feet per month. But the cost in human lives did not stop. Nitroglycerin was unpredictable. Premature detonations killed men without warning. Rock falls buried others under tons of stone that shifted without sound. The shaft itself remained a death trap, with men riding the open wooden platform up and down 1,000 feet of darkness, a single frayed rope between them and the bottom. In 1874, a 14-year-old boy named Orrin Wilson, the son of a tunnel worker, was found near the shaft with his head crushed by an elevator mechanism. He had been exploring. His friend ran away and was too afraid to tell anyone what had happened. If you have been watching this far, if these stories matter to you, I would be grateful if you subscribed. This channel exists to honor the memory of men like these, and every subscription tells us to keep going. In 1868, the Massachusetts legislature appropriated $5 million to finish the tunnel and hired a Canadian engineer named Walter Shanley, along with his brother Francis, to take over the contract. Walter Shanley was born in 1817 in County Laois, Ireland, educated by private tutors in Dublin, and had built his reputation engineering railroads across Canada. He was meticulous, disciplined, and completely unbothered by the scale of what he was being asked to do. The Shanley brothers brought organizational discipline to a project that had been lurching from crisis to crisis for 17 years. Walter systematized the drill, load, blast, muck cycle that would become the standard method for rock tunnel excavation for the next century. Crews drilled a pattern of holes into the face in a specific sequence. The center cut holes were angled inward so that when they detonated, they created a V-shaped void in the rock. Subsequent rounds of holes, detonated in sequence using electric blasting caps, broke rock inward toward that void. Then the muck crews moved in with wheelbarrows and hand carts to clear the debris, and the cycle began again. It was brutal, methodical, relentless work, and under Shanley, the tunnel advanced faster than it ever had. The daily routine inside the mountain never changed. A shift began with the drill crews moving to the face, setting up the Burley drills on their carriages, and beginning to bore the pattern of holes that the blasting plan required. The noise was extraordinary. A dozen pneumatic drills pounding simultaneously in a confined stone chamber created a sound pressure that modern occupational safety standards would classify as immediately dangerous. The men worked without hearing protection. Many of them went partially deaf within months. When the holes were drilled, the blast crew moved in. They loaded each hole with nitroglycerin, inserted the electric blasting caps, ran the wires back to a safe distance, and fired the shot. After the blast, they waited for the dust and fumes to clear, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes longer, depending on how well the air compressors were ventilating the heading. Then the muck crews came in. These were the men with the wheelbarrows, the shovels, the iron pry bars. They loaded the broken rock by hand and hauled it to rail cars that carried it out of the tunnel. Every ton of the 1 million tons of rock removed from the Hoosac tunnel was handled this way, by hand, into a wheelbarrow, onto a car, out of the hole. By 1871, Francis Shanley had returned to Canada, and Walter remained alone as the resident engineer, driving the work forward with a single-minded intensity that consumed his entire life. He turned down opportunities to work on the Canadian Pacific Railway, confessing in a letter that the Pacific was perhaps too big a thing for him. The Hoosac was enough. Nearly 900 men worked under his direction, organized into shifts that kept the tunnel active around the clock. Cornish miners, many of them immigrants who had learned hard rock drilling in the tin mines of Cornwall, England, made up a significant portion of the skilled workforce. They knew stone the way a carpenter knows wood. They could read the grain of the rock, feel the vibration through the drill steel, and know when a seam was about to let go. They brought a tradition of underground labor that stretched back centuries, and they brought something else, a stubbornness, a refusal to be beaten by a mountain, that matched the stubbornness of the engineers who had been fighting the Hoosac for 2 decades. But here is the thing about boring a tunnel from 4 faces that must all converge on the same imaginary line through nearly 5 miles of solid mountain. You cannot see from one end to the other. You cannot use a surveyor's transit to sight through the rock. You are boring blind, guided only by mathematics and the precision of your instruments. Thomas Doane had devised the alignment system before Shanley arrived, and it was an act of engineering genius that deserves its own recognition. Doane constructed 6 survey towers on the peaks and ridge lines above the mountain. Each tower had a stone foundation, a sloped wooden roof, and a transit scope mounted at a precise elevation. A red and white pole extended 25 feet above each tower. In those days, the mountains had been cleared for farmland, so you could see from one tower to the next across miles of open hillside. Doane sighted a perfectly straight line from the east portal to the west portal, running from tower to tower across the summit. Inside the tunnel, surveyors drove wooden plugs into the roof at intervals and hung plumb bobs from piano wire, creating an interior reference line that extended the surface alignment deep underground. The blasting crews followed the plumb bobs. Every few yards, surveyors checked the line. Any deviation was corrected immediately. Think about the tolerances involved. These men were using instruments made of brass and glass, sighting through telescopes in wind and rain, hanging piano wire in a tunnel that shook every time a charge detonated. They were aligning a tunnel that ran for 25,000 feet through solid rock, from 4 separate headings that could not see each other, and they had to hit a target the size of a doorway in the center of a mountain. On December 12, 1872, crews digging eastward from the central shaft broke through to meet the tunnel being bored westward from the east portal. The 2 headings were aligned within 9/16 of an inch, less than the width of a man's finger. Then, on November 27, 1873, the final breakthrough came. The western heading from the central shaft met the tunnel being driven eastward from the west portal. The alignment was off by less than 1/4 of an inch. Not 1/4 of a foot, 1/4 of an inch. Through 4 3/4 miles of mountain, using 19th century instruments, in a tunnel that had been under construction for 22 years. How is that even possible? I have driven the highway that runs over the Hoosac Mountain, Route 2, the Mohawk Trail, and even in a car you feel the mountain. You feel the climb, the weight of the ridgeline above you, the dense forest that closes in on both sides. And somewhere beneath you, 1,000 feet below the road, there is a tunnel that men cut with drills and nitroglycerin and the unaided precision of their own surveying instruments. And those men got it right to within a fraction of an inch. You cannot stand on that mountain and not feel something close to awe. The tunnel was not yet finished at breakthrough. The raw bore had to be lined to create a permanent structure that could withstand the immense weight of the mountain above it. Over 20 million bricks were used to line the interior, creating a continuous arch from portal to portal. The bricks were made locally and hauled into the tunnel on rail cars, then laid by hand by masons who worked in near darkness, building curved forms and filling them course by course. The mortar was mixed on site. The scaffolding was built from timber cut in the surrounding forests. Every brick was placed by a human hand, and the arch they created had to be strong enough to hold back a mountain for as long as that mountain existed. The rock at the western end proved particularly treacherous, a formation the engineers called demoralized rock, meaning stone so fractured and waterlogged that it behaved more like heavy mud than solid geology. Crews in that section worked in water up to their knees, shoring up the walls with timber and brick, while the mountain tried to close the hole behind them. The water was cold. It seeped from every crack and joint in the rock, and it never stopped. Pumps ran constantly, hauling water out of the low points so the crews could work. On some days, the pumps could not keep up, and men worked in flooded headings, their boots full of ice-cold groundwater, their clothing soaked through, the chill settling into their joints and staying there for the rest of their shift. The air in the western heading smelled of wet clay and iron and the organic decay of the demoralized rock itself, a smell like a basement that has been flooded for years. The final cost of the Hoosac Tunnel is a number that depends on who you ask and how you count. The original estimate was $2 million. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts ultimately spent approximately $15 million, though some accounts push the total past $20 million, when interest on state bonds and related infrastructure is included. Either way, it was a staggering sum for the era. Massachusetts had bet its fiscal future on a hole in the ground, and there were years when it looked like the mountain would win. On February 9, 1875, the first train passed through the Hoosac Tunnel. 24 years after construction began, 8 years after 13 men died in the central shaft, 3 years after Walter Shanley pulled off one of the most precise feats of underground surveying in the history of civil engineering, a locomotive rolled through 4 3/4 miles of mountain and emerged on the other side. At completion, the Hoosac Tunnel was the longest tunnel in North America and the second longest in the world, behind only the Mont-Cenis Tunnel through the French Alps. 195 workers did not live to see that train. Some of them died in the central shaft explosion. Some died in premature nitroglycerin detonations. Some died in rock falls, buried under stone that shifted without warning. Some fell from scaffolding. Some were crushed by equipment. Some drowned in the flooded sections of the western heading. Many of their names were never recorded, or were recorded so carelessly that they cannot be recovered. The historical records list some of the dead simply as unknown. Others are identified only by a relationship, brother of someone, son of someone, not even a first name. The Cornish miners who made up much of the skilled workforce were immigrants, men who had crossed an ocean to swing a hammer inside a mountain for wages that would barely cover their board. They brought their expertise in hard rock drilling and their willingness to do work that most Americans would not touch. They sang while they worked, a song called "Drill Ye Terriers Drill," and the lyrics are about exactly what you think they are about. Working all day for the sugar in your tea, down beside the railway. I have stood at the site of the central shaft, on the forested summit of Hoosac Mountain in the town of Florida, Massachusetts. The shaft is still there, capped but visible, a stone-rimmed opening in the earth, surrounded by trees that have grown up over the last century and a half. 4 of the 6 alignment towers that Doane built can still be found, if you know where to look. Stone foundations crumbling in the woods, their transit scopes long gone, the red and white poles rotted away. The forest has reclaimed the cleared slopes that once allowed surveyors to sight from peak to peak. But the bolts that held the alignment markers are still driven into the rock in places, rusted iron stubs poking out of boulders, like the last signatures of the men who put them there. And the tunnel itself is still there. That is the part that stops me every time I think about it. The Hoosac Tunnel is not a museum. It is not a ruin. It is an active rail line. Pan Am Southern operates freight trains through it several times a day. A locomotive pulling 100 cars of containerized freight rolls through the same bore that was cut by men with hand drills and black powder, starting in 1851. The stone portal at the east entrance, in the town of Florida along the Deerfield River, looks much as it did when the first train passed through in 1875. The western portal in North Adams has been modified over the years, fitted with a snow door in the 1950s, but the tunnel behind it is the same tunnel. The same rock walls, the same brick lining, the same alignment that Doane surveyed with brass instruments and piano wire. 1 million tons of rock were removed to create it. Over 500,000 pounds of nitroglycerin were detonated inside it. 20 million bricks line its walls. And 195 men gave their lives inside it, or beside it, or above it, doing work that most of us cannot even imagine. The Hoosac Tunnel was the fountainhead of modern tunnel technology. That is not my phrase. That is the assessment of Louis Kyler of the Hoosac Tunnel Museum Society, and it is not an exaggeration. Every major rock tunnel built in North America after 1875 used methods that were pioneered inside the Hoosac. The Burley drill became the blueprint for the entire pneumatic tool industry. The drill load blast muck cycle that Walter Shanley systematized became the standard operating procedure for tunnel excavation for over a century. The use of nitroglycerin and electric blasting caps, first employed commercially at the Hoosac, became universal. Even the concept of the central shaft, sinking a vertical access point to multiply working faces, became a standard technique for long tunnel construction worldwide. In 1975, exactly 100 years after the first train passed through, the American Society of Civil Engineers designated the Hoosac Tunnel a historic civil engineering landmark. But here is what stays with me more than any of the engineering. More than the quarter-inch alignment, more than the 1 million tons of rock, more than the 500,000 pounds of nitroglycerin. It is the men whose names we do not know. The records list 195 dead. 135 of those deaths are verified. Another 60 were injured so severely that they never worked again, or survived only briefly after their injuries. But the record-keeping was careless. Many of the dead were immigrants. Many were transient laborers who came to the mountain because there was work and left it in a pine box or not at all. Their families waited at the tunnel entrance, sometimes for days, for news of a husband or a father or a brother who had gone down the shaft and not come back up. The historical accounts describe women weeping at the portals, children asking when their father was coming home. And sometimes the answer was that nobody knew, because the body had not been found, or had been found but could not be identified, or had been identified but the name was spelled 3 different ways in 3 different records, and now nobody is sure which name was real. 19-year-old men, 40-year-old men, a 14-year-old boy who was not even supposed to be there, miners from Cornwall, laborers from Ireland, men whose only monument is a hole through a mountain that still carries freight trains 150 years after they died making it. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe to this channel. That is all I ask. Subscribe, so that we can keep finding the names of the men who built this country and saying them out loud. I want to leave you with something that has stayed in my mind since I first stood at the east portal of the Hoosac Tunnel, looking into the darkness that runs 4 3/4 miles into the mountain. Herman Haupt, the man who started it, lost his fortune on the project. He spent decades in court trying to recover his investment and got almost nothing. He died in 1905 at 88 years old of a heart attack on a train, on a railroad. Thomas Doane, the engineer who solved the alignment problem that made the tunnel possible, is a footnote in most histories. Charles Burley, whose compressed air drill launched an entire industry and changed the face of mining and construction worldwide, died in 1883 and is buried in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, in a lot with his 3 sons, none of whom have markers. Walter Shanley, the man who actually finished the thing, went back to Canada and spent the rest of his career in railroad engineering and politics, but the Hoosac was the work that defined him. He died in 1899 in Montreal. And the workers, The 195. The Cornish drillers and the Irish laborers and the unknown men listed in the records as simply unknown. They are still inside that mountain in a way that none of the engineers are. Their dust is in the rock. Their sweat is in the brick lining. The tunnel they built with their hands and their backs and their lives is still open, still carrying trains, still doing the thing it was made to do. I have driven over the Hoosac Mountain many times, and every time I do, I think about the fact that 1,000 feet below my wheels, there is a tunnel that took 24 years and 195 lives to build, and it is still working. The mountain is still there. The tunnel is still there. The men who made it are gone, but the hole they cut through the rock remains. And freight trains still pass through it, several times a day, through the same passage that was once lit by candles and filled with the sound of hammers striking steel. In a darkness so complete that the men who worked at the face could not see their own hands without a lamp. They did that. They went into the mountain and they opened it, and they did not come out whole. But the tunnel did, and it has not closed in 150 years. That is what they built. That is what it cost. And that is what remains.